One of the articles that really inspired me to start looking into the food and climate connection was an article in Harper's Magazine, and essentially the take-home message was, we are eating oil. That if you look at every single step along the chain of food production, industrial food production, you see oil. What we've done is kind of replaced a lot of the natural systems and the ecological systems with fossil fuels. And so even fertilizer now, when people hear about nitrogen fertilizer, they might not necessarily think fossil fuels, but it takes 33,000 cubic feet of natural gas to produce 1 ton of nitrogen fertilizer. And so you're talking about a huge amount of natural gas that's required to produce synthetic fertilizer that's used across most American farmland now to create that and essentially create artificial fertility. We also see the use of fossil fuel-based chemicals. So most people, I think, would realize, okay, if you're not eating organic food, your food was probably raised with some kind of synthetic chemical. But what most people don't realize is that almost all synthetic pesticides are petroleum-based. And so essentially you are eating, your food is dependent on, again, petroleum for the pest resistance and dealing with weeds and all the things that chemicals are used for now on industrial farms. And then the other kind of aspect of the connection between fossil fuels and the food chain is, of course, all of the machinery that's now required on the sort of heavy machinery that's required on industrial farms. The industrial farms are very irrigation dependent, so agriculture uses about 70% of all of the fresh water available to us on the planet. So very irrigation dependent, and of course irrigation requires energy. And then there's the transportation to get our food to our plate. There's all these steps along the way that in each one of them, because we have so industrialized so many aspects, not just of food production, but really of our society, you're talking about fossil fuel dependency all along the way. So definitely one of the biggest myths out there is that we need industrial agriculture to feed the world. And what I find interesting when I hear this myth touted is, of course, it's not presented with any kind of self-criticism, with, for instance, the acknowledgement that this industrial food system that is so dominant right now is actually failing to feed the world today. You know, not only would I argue it can't feed the world in 10, 20 years, but today we have more than 900 million people on the planet who are going hungry. So it's a system that is failing us today, and I would argue it will fail us in the future. And part of the reason why I think we really need to radically reform how we feed the world, how we feed ourselves, how we in the US farm, is because we know that we need to get ourselves off of our addiction to fossil fuels and to oil. We need to get ourselves out of that addiction when it comes to transportation, when it comes to how we power this country, and I would argue when it comes to how we feed this country. And industrial agriculture is predicated on having really, really cheap oil and limitless amounts of water. Two things which we know we will not have. The other thing that I think is really positive about the research coming out on sustainable systems, smaller scale systems, more biodiverse farming systems, what's really positive is that when you look at how those kinds of farms, the farms that are using more ecological ways to deal with pests and weeds and soil fertility, for instance, what you find is that those are the farms that are better able to withstand heavy flooding, that are better able to withstand periods of drought. And I've been to these farms and I've seen farms. There was one farm I visited in Wisconsin just after this really serious flooding had swept the region in the Midwest in 2008. I went to visit a farm that I was expecting to literally see it underwater, and the farmer said that his crops had never been better, and it was because he'd been using techniques to both be sort of prepared when there would be flooding, But essentially his techniques were building such healthy soil that the soil was like a sponge that was able to really absorb so much of the water. And we were standing on his farm, and we could look across the road to the chemical industrial corn farm and literally see a gully that had been dug out of the soil because of the water had so easily eroded the land. And the reason why is because that soil had been so mistreated over years that it was hard as a rock, that it was, when the water hit it, that there was no ability to absorb that water, that it was, there was not all of the healthy microorganisms that you get on a farm, and the healthy root structures and all of that allowed this organic farm to be very resilient. So when I think about what is it that we need in order to feed the world in the future, we need resilient farms. And we find those farms in more biodiverse farms, smaller scale farms, and farms that are really employing agroecological practices, not relying on fossil fuels. So there are really a bunch of simple steps that people can take to just kind of get started on the path. And you know, to me, I think the most, in some ways, for some people this is very simple, and other people it might be more challenging. But I think the number one thing people can do, because it's such an educational experience, is to go to a farmer's market. Even if you just go once, but to go to a farmer's market, it will teach you so much about what's in season in your region. It will show you the faces of the people that are growing the food in your region. It will kind of show you this kind of alternative to the grocery store with the fluorescent lights and the crazy packaging and the kind of bombardment of media messages about food. So to me, I find going to a farmer's market as a kind of a way to re-ground yourself in real food. And I'll go through periods where it'll be a while since I've gone to like a real grocery store. And once you stay out of a grocery store for a while and you go back to one, what you notice is just the overwhelm of messages and packaging, and this box telling you it's healthier than that box, and you know, this box with the green check that it's a smart choice, but how is, you know, this sugary cereal smarter than that one? I mean, it's so confusing, and I understand why people get so confused. And so I think the first step that people can take is to think critically, not about what they buy in the grocery store, but think critically about where they go get their food. And if you go to a farmer's market, it's so relaxing because you know that pretty much everything you get at the farmer's market is going to be good for you. The sugary donuts, cinnamon donuts that I get sometimes at my farmer's market might not be the healthiest choice, but most of the food at the farmer's market is, you know, hands down is so delicious and good for you. You know, I think a lot of people get overwhelmed when they start thinking about how to change their diet, and I certainly think you don't have to do it overnight. You don't have to get everything right or do nothing at all. You know, it's not an either or. But the big thing that I've certainly found with for my family is that making these choices around food, it just takes being a little bit more deliberate. And so the weeks where we really step back and kind of plan for a couple of meals, and how those meals can be retrofitted into good leftovers for lunch, and how those meals can then make good baby food for our daughter, and, you know, kind of really plan, do almost like meal plans, and then plan a shopping list around that. You know, sort of making that a deliberate act has made it much easier. So the weeks where we do that, I feel like we eat the kind of diet for Hot Planet diet. We do it really well. And the weeks where we don't plan, it's really hard, and we find ourselves, both my husband and me, you know, exhausted after a long day's work, looking inside a refrigerator, wondering what to do. So that planning is really important. And then the second thing that I think is really important is to realize that cooking with good ingredients is very easy, in the sense that the ingredients, if they're good and tasty and fresh, they will kind of speak for themselves. So it doesn't take as much, I would argue, it doesn't take as much cooking to cook with good fresh ingredients. You know, one of my most favorite dishes lately is, my friend has an amazing garden, and with basil that's just bursting, you know, there's just too much basil to know what to do with. And so she keeps bringing me bags of basil, and we're getting tomatoes from our community-supported agriculture farm, and just a simple dish of sliced mozzarella with slices of tomato and fresh basil leaves and a little bit of sea salt, a little bit of pepper, and a little bit of olive oil, and a little bit of balsamic. It takes as much time as getting a slice of pizza at the corner, and yet it's so much more delicious. And And so for me, I've come into this work more from the environmental justice and social justice perspective, and kind of the cooking of food is, of course I love the way good food tastes, but I'm not a chef. And I've definitely discovered that there are just some basic cooking principles that once you get them under your belt, gives you so much confidence. And so I've really enjoyed Alice Waters' The Art of Simple Food. There's a lot of really, really simple recipes in there. Again, she really lets the food speak for itself. Mark Bittman has a fabulous book called How to Cook Everything Vegetarian that is just fabulous. And a lot of it is just, again, really kind of basic principles of, what's a basic bread recipe? I mean, bread to me seemed like this absolutely exotic thing to make, but it's actually not that complicated, or what's a simple soup recipe, what's a simple frittata recipe. I mean, these kind of basic recipes, and then once you have those basics, you can throw anything into a frittata. You can throw any vegetables into your soup once you've got that base. And you realize you can kind of liberate yourself in the kitchen and demystify cooking, that you don't have to be a contestant on Top Chef to be able to make a good meal for your family.